Hey everyone, we're starting off tonight with a very unusual and painful poem. The Aztec Empire's judicial system, a society renowned for its pyramids. The Aztecs did more than just sacrifice. They also used blood-soaked rites and precise calendars. For religious reasons, they also established a penalized legal system. Those were both imaginative and disturbing. So before you settle in, please take a moment to subscribe and like the video, but only if you truly like what I do here. Please, let me know in the comments. What time is it for you and where are you tuning in? It's always interesting to see who is joining us. Dim the lights worldwide now, and perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle imagine stealing food and being hauled nude as we begin tonight's journey together, with a background hum, through the city, while being forced to breathe in smoke until you fainted, or having chili powder applied to your wounds. These were not the actions of a lunatic because you cut down the wrong tree. According to Aztec law, punishment in ancient society consisted of both performance and policy. So what were some of the most bizarre, cruel, and sometimes amusing ways when people think of the Aztecs? Let's start with how they maintained order. Empire. People frequently envision priests wielding obsidian knives, blood-soaked pyramids, and heart sacrifices. A society renowned for its generous treatment of human resources. But that the Aztecs had a surprisingly well-organized judicial system and didn't just lash out at those who irritated them. The Aztec court system was highly developed, violent, but not anarchic. Rules and a framework that would make your homeowners association envious were incorporated into a compendium of sage advice and guidelines known as the Huheti that addressed everything from market behavior and marriage to how to avoid dying in agony in front of others. These judges existed even though there were no leather-bound law books. Laws were handed down through the generations. Genuine specialist officials who were very serious about their work. They had severe faces, no powdered wigs, and an outstanding, you may argue that they had appeals courts and that memory for punishment alternatives. If the community already perceived you as that thief, your prospects of getting judges were poor. Priests, or older nobility who were regarded as intelligent, were frequently the corn-twice judges. Knowledgeable and well-versed in legal customs, therefore, they weren't beyond accepting bribes. But if you were, everyone played the game carefully because if you were caught bribing them, you may be put to death. This is what made Aztec justice. Its combination of pomp and morality made it genuinely distinctive. Justice wasn't simply meted out. Punishments were administered with the intention of teaching lessons, not in private. However, you didn't simply pay a fee for a crime. You did it loudly, in public, and frequently with props. You were shaved, painted, dragged, or otherwise changed into a leg-equipped warning poster. And this is the most in the Aztec world. Several penalties varied according on your social class. Aristocrats faced more severe penalties and were held to higher standards. A noble who committed the same deed could lose his head or land titles, while a commoner might be fined or whipped. Therefore, no Aztec justice was not arbitrary. Rather, it was shrewd, fashionable, and rather theatrical. Additionally, the empire ensured that you would never forget breaking the law, and your neighbors did the same. Thus, you have broken the law. Perhaps you stole a basket of pulque from the Aztec Empire or consumed it while underage. Maize. Or perhaps, and hopefully, you won't cut down a sacred tree, whatever of your offense. Don't bother phoning your attorney because there aren't any Aztec courts where you're going to appear. Extremely regimented, but not particularly comfortable. Think. More of a stone platform with stern men surrounding it. Feathered cloaks, rather than a quaint courtroom play where the trial would occur. It was not intended for theatrics, unless you count the part, and is frequently performed in public in a plaza or temple court. Circumstances when a person could be whipped, painted, or shaved in front of a crowd, usually heard by judges who are skilled noblemen or Claxitan wise elders. They weren't just appointed at random under the empire's laws and conventions. Have to spend years studying, memorize a lot of the law code, and learn how to tell a liar from 10 paces away. The accused could defend themselves, so don't quarrel with them unless you enjoy the sound of public flogging. Occasionally, an elder or family member may speak on their behalf, But let's be honest, until you are either persuasive or extremely fortunate, the odds were probably not in your favor, and there were witnesses to support your claims. Perhaps possibly several courts, such as an emperor-level appeal and a high court. Yes, you could fight your way to the top, but it was a difficult path, and if the emperor decided you, one thing you'll notice is that, let's say, there won't be much documentation once you're found guilty. Swiftly, the Aztecs didn't think that lengthy trials were necessary, or that things should be prolonged. After years of discussion, decisions were made quickly, and punishment frequently occurred on the same day. There are no Aztec jails, and that's efficiency. Terrifying. Skin-peeling efficiency. Criminals were either fined, humiliated, enslaved, or executed, sometimes all four. But society didn't hold them in reserve, were never forgotten. Aztec courts focused on morality rather than legal rights or intricate details. Clarity, public spectacle, and social order. So if you're in front of an Aztec judge, stand up and speak cautiously and avoid perspiring too much because they are aware of that kind of stuff. Children who misbehave typically receive a timeout or even a harsh lecture, and the smoke from Chile was a little more intense than what the Aztec Empire had. Chamber, perhaps the most spectacular way in history to convey, listen to your mother. In Aztec homes, obedience wasn't voluntary. Kids had to labor, listen, show respect for their elders, and help out around the house. The plan was to simply teach kids to be good from a young age. Hard-working citizens, aspiring soldiers or weavers, and if little Cuauhtémoc got the chili because he didn't want to mop the floor or dared to respond. Cleal was the name of the punishment, which entailed putting the recalcitrant youngster in a tiny contained area, like a storage room or hut, where chilies had been tossed onto a fire and were burning. The smoke in the room was so strong that it burned your eyes, constricting your throat and making your sinuses scream pepper, spray. But the youngster was not physically hurt, at least not permanently, with spiritual intent. They were not battered, bruised, or bleeding, and the experience was amazing. Instead, they were overpowered by chili vapor's sensory assault, which lasted for several hours, of parental yelling in a short period of time with the intention of shame-based conditioning, rather than cruelty. After you've coughing up your will to misbehave means you won't likely disrespect your parents again, at least not until you can speak again. Children were punished by being compelled to carry or sweep temples in public, or by being pricked with cactus needles, bundles of firewood that were too heavy for them. These actions weren't meant as amusement. Rather, they were rites of correction. And in a community where everyone has a civic responsibility to maintain discipline, was not negotiable, and even children of nobles were not exempted. Rather, they were held to greater ideals. A noble youngster who disregarded an elder or instructor could be beaten, tied, or even briefly enslaved. Not long-term, but enough to make the teachings both literally and figuratively painful if you were raised in an Aztec culture. Real repercussions followed rebellion, along with perhaps a few weeping, flaming afternoons spent marinating in chili. Yes, smoke is peppery, but it's also really effective. Nobody can forget their first experience in a chili sauna, and the Aztec Empire had one of the most harsh perspectives of antiquity. Stealing was not only a moral transgression, but also an assault on the food, tools, clothing, firewood, and the social system all had worth and were taken into consideration. Not only did it anger your neighbor, but it also offended the gods, and the Aztecs were punished. Weren't into nuance, and for first-time offenders, things began fairly. A thief could have to give back the restitution for stolen items, public humiliation, or even a few lashes, painful but manageable, a haircut that read, "I steal things." If you steal again, you entered the world of slavery. The Aztecs preferred that you pay off your debt rather than putting you in jail. You might be sent to the victim as a personal servant who would work in quiet if you are caught a second time. Every step you take is a reminder that honesty would have been simpler if you had been brave and/or stupid enough. When theft occurred a third time, the terrible punishment was frequently the ritual skinning process, was long, unclean, and not at all private. Formal and openly shown, this was about more than simply suffering. The skin was seen as a holy covering and an integral component of your identity in order to. Sometimes the skin was removed in order to dehumanize you in the eyes of the community, sometimes in pieces, other times complete, and it wasn't simply discarded in religious rituals. A priest may even don the skin for a short while to worship the soil goddess, who symbolizes rebirth and a single macabre package sound for punishment. It was terrible, and that's why this type of justice wasn't simply about. The message was about a skinned thief in the market square, and the person prevented 1,000 more crimes, since it caused you to reconsider putting a jade bead in your shirt or swiping tamales. The Aztecs' message was unmistakably steal once, and they believed in the power of example and the rule of law. We'll work if you steal 3 times after we warn you to stop. In the Aztec Empire, having a spouse who needed your skin was not merely a sacred ties connected to cosmic balance, family honor, and the social contract economic ties, hence the penalty for breaking those ties with a little extracurricular amorous activity was death by blunt instrument, not divorce court. Let's start with the fundamentals. Adultery was a public capital offense rather than a private disgrace. Prosecuted and harshly punished. And not only men were allowed to blame. Women may also make accusations, but the empire didn't provide therapy. When a guy was discovered having an affair with another man's wife, the husband had several options, but none of them included giving the woman another chance. Most typical punishment, which is public execution frequently by bludgeoning with a stone club. Heavy tool known as a makua wititul, which resembled a sword and had obsidian blades inserted in it. But for household dishonor, the direct approach completed the task in a severe and comprehensive manner, and occasionally the penalty wasn't left up to the courts. In some situations, the harmed spouse may serve out the punishment. Speaking directly about closure, women who were detected cheating suffered similarly terrible outcomes. It was possible to die by stoning, strangulation, or being flung off a cliff. Naturally, nobility were held accountable based on the location and the specifics of the treason. Stronger regulations, since when the rich cheat, it's not just a scandal, it's possible fall of a dynasty, and, of course, the drama. The accused may be paraded through the streets, shaved, painted and ridiculed if the affair was made public. Shame was not a consequence of receiving their final sentence. Rather, it was a component of the sentence now. If you were wrongly accused, that was just another lie. Being punished for adultery, and the Aztecs didn't put up with character assassination unless it came solid proof. And they paid attention to what witnesses said, so there were no rumors. Scheming for retribution, unless you like playing with obsidian, which is central to Aztec culture. Marriage was a holy institution, and breaking it was an insult to society, as well as a moral transgression. Laws and gods. So if you've ever questioned if ancient societies were concerned, the Aztec Empire's solution to the question of monogamy was yes to death. You've heard of being penalized for stealing, killing, and even having an affair. But what about tearing? Down in the Aztec Empire, some trees weren't merely leaves and wood. They were revered. They stood for the ancestors, the gods, or the equilibrium of nature. And if you choose to cut one down in your boundless wisdom for firewood, bid your home and possibly your dignity farewell to some trees. Those planted close to temples, marketplaces, or shrines in particular were thought to be protected by divine right. Harming one was regarded as a spiritual transgression rather than merely a vandalism act. You weren't only harming the environment, you were also disrespecting the. If you violate cosmic order for the first time, you could be publicly thrashed. Yes, they made nature punish you by frequently using prickly branches or cactus spines. Poetic. Justice with a prickly edge in and of itself. But it wasn't the worst of it. You would frequently additionally have to make restitution payments in the form of merchandise, work, or maybe losing your house. your belongings may be seized or set on fire. Furthermore, in certain areas, the guilty tree cutter was paraded through the town as locals threw insults, and occasionally, pebbles were used to show everyone that this fool had messed with you, not merely to cause bodily harm. God's landscaping, and you may be enslaved if you committed the same crime repeatedly, particularly if the tree you damaged was next to a place of worship, as it seems that if, to modern ears, it might sound ridiculous that you couldn't respect a tree's roots because you didn't deserve your own, punished for cutting a branch, although this was a significant offense to the Aztecs, wasn't passive. Rather, it was alive, holy, and closely related to the trees of God. Mountains and rivers weren't resources, they were family members, and they were hurting them. Yes, if you were an Aztec, it would be like slapping your grandmother without her consent and hoping no one saw. Empire. You had to be aware of your bot regulations regarding the tree outside your neighbor's residence. Better ask the dubious person at the store first, and don't touch anything. Because ignorance isn't happiness. In this life, it's simply flammable property and thorny bruises. Teenage drinking typically results in a lecture, a terrible hangover, or a very in the Aztec Empire. An uncomfortable journey home with your parents culminated in execution. To be clear, the Aztecs had a cherished tradition of drinking alcohol. Pulque is a revered beverage prepared from the fermented sap of the maguey plant. Was rich in ceremonial meaning, foamy and slightly sour. Pulque was utilized in religious rituals, celebrations, and even funerals for it was seen as divine and therapeutic by adults, particularly priests and elders. But one drink was a death sentence for teenagers, and young Aztecs were pulque was for those who were supposed to be disciplined, courteous, and completely sober, who had gained it via wisdom or combat age. Youth was a period for education. Rather than teenage drinking and partying was not only discouraged, but also viewed as a sign of moral decay. Therefore, if a teenager was, for a first-time offender, the punishment for being caught drinking was severe and immediate. Bald and shaven, a sign of disgrace, were occasionally paraded around the streets as locals threw garbage or obscenities, a mobile reminder that good choices are preferable to fermented ones. Yet the punishment for repeat offenders, extremely rapid execution, frequently, in public, by beating or strangulation. The technique was intended to help one teen remember things, not to create conflict. For a decade, even noble-born kids weren't able to sober up the rest of the neighborhood by simply hanging from a pole, spared. In fact, they were subject to more stringent requirements than a prince caught drinking may be punished with ceremonial humiliation in the royal court, or sent to a chilly, isolated shrine. Message privilege doesn't justify stupidity, which is why it's so bad because for the Aztecs, intoxication was a sign of spiritual decay and a prelude to sloth, disrespect, disobedience, and intoxication in a society that relied on discipline, order, and cosmic balance. The next time you imagine a wild Aztec party, remember that teenagers were ticking time bombs, unless you were an old, high-ranking authority when going to a funeral. Otherwise, your throat would have become moist. Under the Aztec Empire, work was valued as a virtue rather than just a chore. Society is intertwined with civic duties and expectations that impact everyone, from commoners to, if you had been involved. In the huge cosmic machine, what may have happened didn't fulfill your responsibilities. Therefore, in other words, you'll return to work shortly, but not by choice. Laziness and slacking off were not seen as personality traits. Tlaloc's idiosyncrasies, in particular, were considered sins against the gods. God of rain and harvests, as well as Tezcatlipoca, who kept a careful eye on morale. The gods did not provide you abundant crops, so you could sleep in the shade because of what you did. The Aztecs ensured that a man would face consequences if he ignored the order of labor. If he consistently ignored his civic duties or failed to provide for his family, he might be dragged into the marketplace. His head may be shaved, and his clothes replaced with rags when he is publicly humiliated. Sometimes he had to carry piles of firewood throughout town while people wore awful clothes or screamed at him. However, that was the softer version, implying that repeat offenders would face physical violence, such as, "Behold the man who does nothing," with pole-mounted rods, or if their slackness was perceived as willful disobedience, enslaved for a brief time, but long enough to understand that you're either beneficial or even young individuals of noble birth who were employed were constantly observed if a young man of high status. His family may request that he be placed in a house of youth if he disregarded his temple duties or declined to train for battle. It was not so much a summer camp as it was a military boot camp with cacti. Penalties for women's laziness, despite the fact that they had a variety of tasks, including mazes, grinding, and weaving. It was expected of mothers to maintain the home, and they would feel ashamed if they didn't, to raise industrious children instead of slothful ones that waste their time in the chewing maze. According to Aztec belief, harmony is upset by the inaction of a lethargic person, puts in danger the well-being of their family, communal harmony, and divine favor. Therefore, if you were going to sit by the chinampa and forget to pick corn, you had better start running, because the punishment would not be silent or optional in the bustling hub of the world. The Aztec Empire's tianquisli, or marketplace, was, other than being honest when selling watered poor produce, negotiable in addition to being unethical. Using downpulk or fake obsidian was against the law. Furthermore, you were betraying the Aztecs, who did not tolerate malicious behavior in the marketplace. Deities who support commerce, farming, and fair trade for all merchants. Markets were typically regarded as sacred spaces where individuals were required to exchange jade or sell tamales in accordance with strict ethical standards. Overseen by appointed officials known as the Pochatl market's inspectors or judges. Walking between the stalls, listening for complaints, and identifying slips and falls are some of their responsibilities. Stones into their chili powder, and selling faulty products carried harsh and well-known punishments. Your hands being bound, your fruit being scattered everywhere, and your stall being toppled could all be considered first-time infractions. In front of everyone, customers would yell things like "there goes" as they went by, selling something that has been misrepresented, like the shady individual with the wormy avocados. Worse yet, painted feathers known as sacred quetzal plumes may cause you to slapped, penalized, or, in the worst cases, kicked out of the market entirely. And in a world where markets were your lifeline, being banished wasn't a relief. Economic death made it possible to brand or enslave repeat criminals. Future clients would know they should never trust your mangoes again if your deception caused serious harm. You might even be executed for offenses, like peddling toxic herbs as medication. Maintaining market trust was just as important as punishing the offender, especially if they were a high-ranking individual, was where communities gathered, families resided, and buyers paid their homage. Stopped placing their faith in merchants, the system began to collapse, and even sellers of sacred goods were outlawed. Incense, ceremonial materials or idols were closely watched in case a temple dealer was caught. Delivering subpar products at outrageous tribute prices, they weren't just scammers. They were also misleading the gods, and the deities sent plagues rather than reimbursements. So if you thought you might barely make it past the marketplace with a bright smile and a painted corncob, but in Tenochtitlan, the phrase, "buyer beware," has a particularly keen edge if you were ever in an Aztec courtroom. Among the elders in feathered cloaks, standing in front of a priest judge with piercing eyes, is one golden, "Don't be too dishonest," is the norm. Remember not to add extraneous details or fabricate your own version of events, because in the Aztec Empire, lying was not only wrong, but also deadly to the Aztecs. Truth was important to them, as being honest is more than just being courteous in court. It also entails upholding harmony, order, and divine law. But equilibrium has corrupted the social order and infuriated the gods, especially Tezcatlipoca, the god of truth and night judgment. Your creative story was not appreciated by him There were no security cameras or forensic labs, thus witness evidence was essential to court procedures. Someone else, and that word carried a lot of weight when you lied in court. You might have wrongfully condemned someone to slavery or death, in addition to tipping the scales. Perjury executions sometimes involve strangling and stoning, or being beaten to death. If the lie was found out after the fact, depending on the location and the extent of your dishonesty. If you were put on trial and someone else suffered as a result of your false statements, you would often find yourself living through the same catastrophe you produced. It was jagged-edged poetic justice, and even minor lies had serious repercussions. Public beatings, exile, or ritual humiliation are possible outcomes. They might be painted black, the color of dishonesty, or they might be bald and carried through the market with a sign surrounding them. Reading a statement like "talks too much, tells too little truth," accusers were not only punished for lying, but they were also seen as social threats. It is willing to thwart the rule of law, harm individuals, and face divine vengeance for selfish gain. Aztec law was not about technicalities, but about morality. Clarity and truth was a fundamental connection to them, non-negotiable. So if you've ever been arrested and wished that a simple lie would be enough to cleanse your name, remember that while the truth might set you free during the Aztec Empire, a falsehood could. Although there weren't many second chances, the Aztecs believed in them. Bury you. A first offense could result in a warning. The legal system was harsh, but not heartless. A punishment or a beautiful public flogging will help you remember the lesson, and you'd have to cope with something more serious, such as public humiliation, servitude, or losing your possessions. But with a third infraction, the situation escalated to the point where it was practically a ritual. Because repeated transgressions were proof, not just an inconvenience. Execution was a serious problem for the Aztecs, because you had refused to live in accordance with the Aztec principle of equilibrium. The crops thrived because society worked. The sun rose because people did what they were supposed to do, and when someone broke the rules over and over again, they were not just annoying, they were a danger to cosmic order. Let's say you returning the items is the first step, being a slave is the second, and being a thief is the third. The law is entirely on your side when you're gently skinned in public, and maybe the region, or maybe you were disciplined for lying in court again, was not only more serious than before, but it also represented the many lies you told. Society considers you to be inhuman, and people who lose their humanity become warning signs. Physical punishment was only one aspect of warning stories and the potential for repeat offenders to lose their legal rights. Total protection, which implied that you could be harmed, forced into slavery, or publicly humiliated, since you had no legal options and were neither exiled nor imprisoned. You were unpersoned. In some cases, a repeat offense may be permanently banished from the market or town. Even their own family imagines being spiritually exterminated, but not because of the gods. Left you, but due to your frequent violations of the social contract. Although criminals were not always evil and may be changed. The Aztecs thought that repeat offenders were something that, worse, unwilling to learn. And in a society where the public quickly imposed justice and divine, the state rehabilitated those who refused, without much delay. Therefore, you were lucky if you were caught once. You were warned if you were caught twice. Nevertheless, if you stood, after your third court appearance, you had already departed from the contemporary judicial system. Punishment usually occurs behind closed doors in courtrooms or private jail, cells, hearings, but under the Aztec Empire, punishment wasn't a public spectacle. It was meant to educate not only the criminal, but also everyone else. For the Aztecs, fear and shame was a weapon as important as clubs and cactus whips if someone saw. They would remember your humiliation long after the pain had passed and think twice before stealing the tamalai. As a result, almost every type of punishment, from flogging to execution, was carried out outside, usually in the midst of the outside of temples, at the bazaar, or in the neighborhood. These were places where people gathered to socialize, pray, and trade things. Perfect for sharing knowledge with your loved ones, friends, and enemies. Imagine being discovered stealing or lying and then being brought to the plaza. You're splattered in paint, your clothes are torn, and your head might be shaved as a throng gathers, with black soot to represent your shame, and a beating is the first part of the punishment. Sitting in a hut and smoking a tasty chili could be a great way to connect if you're still young and reckless. Children who disobeyed elders might be made to walk barefoot across town carrying heavy bundles of wood by lazy workers. In front of a sea of silent or not so silent onlookers, adulterers may be paraded with placards around their necks and strangled or stoned. Instead of being an act of random cruelty, public punishment for bystanders was a remembrance ritual. The Aztecs understood that pain fades, humiliation reverberates, and that social order was upheld by echo. There were no permanent jails, or instead of making criminals disappear, the goal of jail was to transform or destroy them in the open. During an execution, a thief may be flayed, but not in a dimly lit rear room. Every passerby in the square where he had formerly sold stolen goods saw his execution under Aztec law as a living metaphor. The innocent were meant to have privacy. The guilty were supposed to be seen, heard, and remembered for more than their deeds. But for what came next, for your actual punishment in this world, wasn't death or pain, but rather becoming in the Aztec Empire. Punishment was more complex than you would have imagined. Concerning your beliefs, it wasn't sufficient to merely hurt others. You also needed to be understood, and above all, understood that justice in Tenochtitlan was not just a legal process, but also a performance. And you were. Imagine, poor star, that you stole clothes, tools, or food. If it was, instead of being beaten, for your first offense, you may have had your head shaved. Your body was smeared in black soot, and you were paraded around in squalor, like torn rags or enormous tunics, tied in knots that made you look foolish, or suggested that you had lied, which was awful symbolically but not physically. In court, you can use charcoal to make sure that everyone can see how dishonest you are. Would understand that since the stain would speak for itself, it was unnecessary to reveal the truth. In the myth, even the colors had symbolic implications. Black was associated with dishonesty and crimson with shame. The Aztecs knew that in cases of serious crime, striped or dyed garments might be saved for public punishment. That great offenders were treated the same way because the human eye retains what it has been trained to fear. Even worse, a noble child caught drunk might be passed off as a commoner and forced to clean temple floors, a clear inversion of his role in Aztec culture. Image was powerful, showing what happens when the rich ignore their status, even. The symbolic application of cactus spines as a form of discipline was not exclusive to, in terms of the suffering. It symbolized nature's judgment when it came to carrying heavy loads. Symbolized the burden of shame. And a shorn head wasn't only an odd sight. It communicated the impression that you had lost your social integrity and that crime wasn't a private mistake that publicly interrupted the hallowed flow of order, and society needed lasting images, in addition to consequences to heal it. Actual instances of the strong relationship between morality and the law in Aztec society. Punishment was a visual storytelling performance that was intended to be repeated through rumors. Melodious and dreadful memory. You were no longer only a criminal but a representation in. In the majority of nations, punishment typically entails incarceration, wall construction, and penalty in years or months. But the Aztec Empire had none. Prisons, because the Aztecs believed that issues shouldn't be held until they were fixed. To the Aztec, mental punishment quickly, publicly, and often permanently was to restore someone to a position of authority in the entire world, not to exclude them from society. There was no need to create a jail, feed a prisoner, or pay for a guard system, and there were no humiliating repercussions. You might become enslaved and have to work off your earnings if you stole .crime, but instead of leaving society, you remained there as a warning. For example, if you committed dishonesty, you would display the symptoms on your body. A serious violation, the neighborhood observed, as the penalty was promptly given, and the gods were invoked, and repeat offenders could not receive punishment. If you were just stubborn or a menace to others, your story did not end there. A door with iron bars, but despite their nobleness, the marketplace, plaza, and temple stairs do not require parole. Captured enemy rulers or high-ranking criminals were not put in jail. They were treated according to their status and held in temporary ceremonial captivity until their scheduled execution. Sacrifice. But as their time was running out, it was squandered. There were not many of these tiny holding chambers, which were more like interim detention centers before punishment than actual jails. You are protected by warriors, and you weren't sent there to get better. You were placed there to wait for the system to function since Aztec law relied on it. Punishment became unnoticeable when its visibility and immediacy were delayed. The Aztecs thought that punishments like imprisonment deprived society of the lesson, the most important component. Hence the Aztecs developed rituals to hide their criminals, while other societies built structures to alert you that disobeying the law will have urgent, obvious, and long-lasting repercussions. Because in this empire, they have balance, and didn't need bars, as you've probably seen by now. For a very long time, the Aztec Empire did not believe in second chances, and their punishments were severe and symbolic, often unpleasant. And that was exactly what the Aztecs wanted. Of justice was focusing on punishment, even if it was a chili instead than rehabilitation. The idea was to engrave the design of a smoky sauna on a cactus that was being flayed or whipped in the plaza. The crime into the collective recollections of the offender, the witnesses, and the entire community, a jail-free society, relied on a much more potent fear, humiliation, and the first line, "You'll never believe what I saw in the marketplace today." As a result, the Aztec legal system was both extremely strong and terrible, which caused people to remember, because you might not live long enough to forget that moral clarity was ingrained in society as a whole. We're taught at a young age that transgression resulted in both pain and spectacle, and adults understood that crime wasn't. It was a cosmic imbalance that the gods didn't want for a long time, not just a personal failing. Court proceedings. The empire provided the action they requested, but here's the catch. At least for them, social order was maintained despite the system's violence, kept marketplaces running efficiently, kids were polite, and clerics weren't. Pickpocketed at ceremonies, and all it needed to consider breaching the law was a quick look at the "you immediately" remembered the rules as the man with the soot-smeared face and shaven head hobbled past you. It is evident that the Aztecs practiced morality in addition to punishment. Every offense was a chance for instruction. Every outcome was theatrical. And you didn't learn by seeing a punishment you never wanted to go through yourself, but by reading a scroll, and if you couldn't. The approach allowed for learning well, especially in a society without long-term non-learners in jails were turned into warnings, indicating that you either remembered the rules or didn't live long enough to break them once more, which was Aztec justice quick, symbolic, and all-encompassing. The methods that were important prior to her becoming the bane of Chota, the emblem of sea-born rebellion and a Roman trader, was a woman negotiating the harsh politics of as she wedded the burgeoning Aryan country, instead of inheriting her throne peacefully. The Ardea tribe, one of the strongest Aryan alliances on the eastern Adriatic coast, was led by King Agran's wife. Tutor entered a world where maritime traffickers, warlords, and raiders. Agron was a powerful monarch renowned for his expansionist and military aspirations. Campaigns under his command, Iria developed into a formidable naval force, but Inti's unexpected death in 231 BCE due to illness, or possibly a drinking spree, depending on which old rumor you think put the kingdom in jeopardy role, and Tutor took over as the regent instead of a distraught widow. This was not a ceremonial act for her underage stepson Pines. Instead of waiting for advisors behind silk curtains, the post-Tutor took. She ruled during a period when the fleet, and more significantly, the throne, piracy was essentially a national pastime in Yemen. not merely something that was accepted. In the views of their own people, pirates were not criminals. Rather, they were the mainstay of the local economy that they raided. Under Tut's rule, merchant vessels controlled important trade routes via the Adriatic and Ionian seas and demanded tribute. Not only did Regency piracy persist, but it also grew and was licensed. She vehemently defended it, saying that to her, it was a valid kind of combat, and that to many Irians, it was unrespectable profession. Instructor was knowledgeable about her work in a world where Athens had fading and Rome hadn't reached the other side of the ocean yet. She noticed a void, and she flooded it with Irian sails. Yet even though she might have controlled the Adriatic, her audacity would eventually incite a force that disliked maritime meddling. Rome slowly, but assuredly, increasing its influence while keeping an eye on how Roman trade was impacted by Irian piracy. Roots. For the Romans, Toyota's dominance would no longer be a regional issue, but rather a global one. Determined that a long-term fix was required after the Queen of the Sea, and rocks roused a big Tutter's pirates, who weren't. They were attacking Roman convoys, demanding tribute from Greek cities, and plundering lone merchant vessels. This wasn't piracy, it was Roman protection, and they even pillaged ports along the western coast to Rome. It was an insult, and by 230 BCE, the Roman senators were notorious for not responding to insults. Had had enough, so the Senate sent an official diplomatic mission to deliver a warning wrapped in diplomatic guises to Toyota's palace. But the lead diplomat, Lucius Caranius, a Roman, was armed with a blade behind his back, was renowned for being direct and giving the Irian clear orders. When the delegation arrived, Rome would either act or the Queen would put an end to the piracy. They most likely met in the capital of Skodra, Tot. Picture the setting with the marble columns, Tyrians wearing helmets with crests, and a queen sitting, not in terror, but in complete. They were greeted by the command tutor, but when they brought Rome's message to her, her response was icy. In her own words, it was the kind of response that only a monarch with salt in her veins would make. She asserted that Irian rulers had consistently allowed their subjects to make a decision, as later documented by Roman historians. She basically informed Rome that they were free to live as they wanted, including by engaging in piracy. Rome, what transpired at sea was beyond her control and wasn't really the solution. Desired, and then one of the Roman envoys made a potentially deadly error. Emboldened by Roman pride or simply conceitedness, he publicly attacked Tutor, claimed that she was acting like a woman, suggesting that she was emotionally weak and unsuited to decide whether or not it constituted sexist, diplomacy, or just plain dumbness. That comment cost him his life shortly after he was killed on Tutor's instructions, a choice that would reverberate across the Roman Empire's marble floors. Senate Rome was incensed that a Roman envoy's death was more than a diplomatic breach. It was an act of war, and this would be the first war in Rome's history, military operation across the Adriatic, marking the start of its eastern expansion. Whether it was out of pride or pure force, Mediterranean Teuto had forced her to act. She had gone too far, and now Rome was arriving, not with envoys, but with... The instructor was probably aware that the Queen had roused the Republic's wrath, and that there would be no more warnings. Even she could have misjudged the scope and velocity of the Roman reprisal. But Rome's retaliation would not be minor. In just 1 year after their envoy, Rome was assassinated. In 229 BCE conducted its very first military campaign across the Adriatic Sea, and it was incredibly well planned and effective. With a fleet of more than 200 ships, 2 consuls were sent out that exceeded anything Iria had ever seen. This wasn't instead of a normal raid or border conflict, it was a full-scale invasion, and Tota was still in power as regent, and the Navy's supreme commander did her utmost to ready her forces. But Iria Rome was made up of a patchwork of tribes. Despite her nautical prowess and formidable warriors, was a machine. Thus the Romans wasted no time in attacking the Greek metropolis. States on the coast that Irian soldiers had invaded or harassed, today's Corfu, which had been taken by Irian pirates, was freed by Apollonia, and Epidamus swiftly fell under Roman rule and became a naval base. The message was clear. Under Roman protection, the Adriatic would no longer tutor wasn't hiding in Iria's playground, so she deployed her fleet to protect it. Irian pirates persisted in attacking where they could along the coastlines, although the tide was changing because every time the Romans launched a raid, they took a fortress. The Roman navy, however, knew to, as Rome progressed. The eastern waterways were brutal and learning quickly. Irian allies started to siege cities that were formerly regarded as leaders, opened their gates to Rome in the hopes of gaining the leniency and allegiance she had previously inspired. The pirate queen started to deteriorate, particularly when Roman troops moved inland and forced a decision with a survive by the end of the year: Roman or besieged queen. The capital of Skodra Tutta was surrounded by warriors. What had begun a monarch defending her people's way of life was quickly turning into a now. The siege Tutta had to make a choice that no king or queen ever wants to make until the end and run the risk of being destroyed or submit to a foreign power. The queen, who had dominated the waters, but suddenly she was encircled by hostile ships. Her destiny and delirious was in jeopardy. Since Roman soldiers were advancing on one by one, Skodra and her allies fell apart as Tutta's once powerful influence started to diminish like a retreating flood. Her coastal fortress network essential for once a Irian realm. The Adriatic Sea was collapsing under Roman pressure as a result of attacks and ship replenishment. The Sea Queen had lost her domain due to the presence of Roman warships, but Tutta was not a fool. Although she exercised resistance in her ruling, she knew when to give in, particularly when in 228 BCE, with survival at stake and against insurmountable odds, she did what no one anticipated, that the arrogant pirate queen would file a lawsuit for peace and engage in discussions were intentionally degrading, and Rome intended to use her as an example, so they requested. She ceded crucial forts, much of the Irian coastline, and most agonizingly give up her cherished navy Tutta, who was only permitted to govern a tiny inland area of her former realm, and even there, she was required to swear that she would never go farther than a small section of shoreline with more than two unarmed ships was a significant object for a woman who had previously led fleets. Thus, the Adriatic was no longer hers. The Pirate Queen title had been taken away from her by force and answered to Rome, but Tutta wasn't entirely destroyed even after giving up. For a brief period, she kept her title and remained regent, despite having her military reach cut off and her political power destroyed. Her survival of the storm at that time physically demonstrated the shrewdness, and her administration was characterized by realism. In a world where other dissident rulers were, during Roman victories, Tutta was frequently put to death or hauled in chains, but he was spared. Rome might have admired her perseverance or feared that she would become a martyr, but shortly after the peace deal, her power rapidly diminished, is not mentioned in history. But her stepson Pinnes would go on to govern in name, always under Roman oversight. Tutta, who was once a queen with authority over troops and waves, waned. She fell into obscurity, yet in Roman memory, she was the first to confront them at sea, and according to Irian folklore, she stayed a symbol of resistance. A woman who almost lost her life after daring to oppose a growing empire, even though Tutta's reign came to an end in capitulation. Her legacy established the establishment of Rome as a naval superpower, laid the groundwork for one of the most significant shifts in Mediterranean history. Ironically, Rome had to change before Tutta Rome, because of her defiance, had been predominantly a land-based power, with its legions providing its military might and the landowners providing its political influence. Elite, and its attention was always focused on the Italian peninsula and the sea, which was used by traders. As for Greeks and pirates, such as the Irians, Tutta changed that her courageous resistance and the murder of the First Irian Wars. Rome's first significant engagement across the Adriatic was with a Roman envoy needed constructing ships, learning how to navigate the seas, and figuring out how to live in and run coastal cities. But this wasn't. It was only a short-term trip. But the initiation cut didn't only enrage Rome. She made them enlarge, and Rome noted that they failed to dismantle the pirate system and go. Following their triumph, Rome instituted a new one. Guardianships along the Greek and Irian coasts, protecting commercial routes that were previously vulnerable to Tota's raiders, erected benevolent kings, gathered tribute, and constructed the Adriatic, which was once Irian blue, but now shimmered with Roman. It's simple to undervalue the importance of sails, but without Tutor, Rome might never have developed into a naval empire if she hadn't created the problem. She was inadvertently a catalyst early on. Her opposition spurred invention. Aggression brought about a change, and her downfall signaled a tactical change in Roman foreign policy, from protecting borders to crossing them. Naturally, she didn't do this voluntarily. Were never to show Rome how to establish an empire. Instead, she fought to justify her people's independence. To maintain her dominance in a society dominated by men, Aryan seafarers, she would write the legacy of many historical figures who were trapped in the whirlpool of empire. Adversaries. One can't help but ask, if Tut hadn't opposed Rome, would the Republic have stayed a landlocked empire for another generation, or would it have crossed the Adriatic so quickly? In any case, the trickster's acts had altered the map, and history knows that the tale of the Tutor is not only about pirates and power battles, but also about reluctant revolutionaries. In addition, she was a woman dominating in a violent manner. She wasn't just a ruler. Male-dominated society, where authority was typically acquired via lineage, or, ideally, both. Although here was Tutor in charge of ships, making diplomatic choices, and carrying out envoys, and starting global conflicts, the ancient world wasn't friendly to female rulers when they held positions of authority. In particular, Roman and Greek caricatures frequently depicted Cleopatra as attractive, Boudica as wild, and Tutor Aswas, at least in the opinion of Roman historians, harmful and illogical. For instance, Polybius characterizes Tutor as a lady who possesses an inherent vulnerability. Of the eroticism in one paragraph alone reveals the difficulties she faced with Roman writers. Couldn't believe that a woman had started a war in their nation and remained there for more than a year. They blamed it on female feeling rather than political acumen. But let's break through the antiquated narrative that Tutor gained power through strategy rather than scandal or seduction. After her husband passed away, she inherited a precarious monarchy and managed to hold on to it despite political. She inherited piracy, ethnic strife, and instability instead of peace. She was vicious and used such elements as weapons against her antagonistic neighbors. Her execution of the Roman envoy was likely, but so were the majority of the monarchs at the time, was a deliberate, albeit dangerous, political message rather than an act of frenzy. She was using force, the only method she knew of, to protect Irian sovereignty. Think on how this Tutor wasn't killed in a palace intrigue, betrayed in a coup, or ousted by her people. Lost because her people did not rebel against Rome's overwhelming might. Long after she gave up, some of her supporters actually rebelled against Rome. Toyota's reign was brief, since it left her mark etched in a world that hardly ever made room for women in leadership roles. She challenged the most powerful republic of the era and made them take her. She was a queen in battle, despite their historians' attempts to dismiss her. A crisis-ridden monarch and a woman who unnerved the ancient world despite her tenure ending in a centuries later. The story of the humiliated peace tutor remained visible above the waves. Legend continued to whisper to her when her last ship was grounded and her voice went silent. Name near Iria's Adriatic shore, her appearance changed from that of a vanquished regent to something much more timeless, a representation of resistance, femininity, and national pride. In Albanian tradition, Tutor in particular rose above the status of queen. She served as the rebellious matriarch of a community that was isolated from the influx of foreigners. Thus, her name was transmitted through shepherds' oral legends rather than dusty treaties. Today, bronze statues of her are seen in Montenegro and Albania. Reminders of how some kings survived their empires and how great the Syrian Empire was might not have been as large or as well equipped as Rome, but under Tutor's rule, it controlled important. She governed the seaports and coastal cities during one of the final eras when Aryan identity was still politically. Rome started gradually and relentlessly assimilating Aryan after she became independent. Following her fall, culture, language, and government. Tutor's capitulation was not simply a war's conclusion, but it also signaled the end of Aryan sovereignty, and Rome buried her tutor's memory, endured her brief rule in the kingdom under the provinces and prefectures. However, in the 19th and 20th centuries, it became a focal place for subsequent generations, looking for inspiration centuries as Balkan nationalism grew, and nations like Albania started creating new identities based on their historical heritage. Textbooks celebrated Tutor's bravery on the streets and brought her back to life as a hero rather than a sorrowful figure. Many schools adopted her name. She was no longer merely a queen. Even in contemporary study, she was an ancestor of disobedience. Her tale still sparks controversy. Was she a pragmatist or a careless pirate? Was she a woman or a despot who was compelled to accept piracy as state policy? In any case, the death of her spouse and the aspirations of an empire have forced her into a tight spot. Tutor holds a unique woman in ancient history who refused to express regret for her authority, and her choices, whether positive or negative, altered a whole ocean. Her ships might have been destroyed, but her myth continues to travel through time. Tutor's historical reality dissolved into a mythical. It is simple to understand why this figure is half draped in mythology and half draped in actuality. A queen who commands pirates in a coastal realm that defies Rome and disappears from history without a clear in coastal communities like Koto and Ulking. That's the stuff that makes legends. Locals will point to crumbling ruins to tell stories about a queen who once ruled from a tall castle near the sea, and state, even though archaeology provides scant evidence that she's credited with launching herself from cliffs to escape Roman arrest and conceal wealth in hidden island caverns, and to have cursed the waters that deceived her. None of this has ever truly required to be verified, but none of it can be, due to the fact that Tutor was no longer only a person, but rather a symbol, are impervious to defeat. In fact, her name appears to reverberate throughout the water. Queen. Tutor is inscribed on contemporary hotels, cruise ships, and cultural events. She was portrayed as a tragic heroine by romantic writers, but contemporary feminists in the Balkans hail her as Albania, a pioneering symbol of female leadership, has enthusiastically embraced her Tutor monuments, which are frequently now adorn public areas with her hair blown in the breeze and a sword by her side. Along with Scudderbs, schoolchildren learn her name, but the actual Tutor, the myth's woman, is still enigmatic, and we don't know how she passed away. We don't know if she ever felt bad about opposing Rome, and we don't even know how she appeared. Her picture was created by, others were frequently her adversaries, and those who needed her subsequently changed her. Legend. But when your narrative doesn't, perhaps that's a sign of genuine influence. Tutor may have only been in power for a few years, but her obedience to history books, she endures for generations in poetry, place names, and hushed stories. The Roman Empire, which once attempted to eradicate her, is now reduced to rubble over the Adriatic coast. Literature, but the Tutor, continues to sail in remembrance of the pirate queen, who became something. Tutor's name has a lasting impact that extends well beyond the records of antiquity. Her story has not only been used as a historical account, but has also been appropriated, modified, and repeated in ways she never could have predicted. Curiosity. But as a symbol of Albania, Montenegro, and the country, she stands for something essential in the Western Balkans: furious independence of a people that resisted being absorbed by empires. Her tale resonates strongly in an area where has witnessed centuries of Albanian struggle, conflict, and occupation. In particular, Toyota has evolved into a national emblem rather than just a queen. Identity. Her legacy has been interwoven with 19th and 20th century cultural revival movements, fostering defying foreign rule and fostering pride in a pre-Roman Irianin, a world where languages and allegiances have become muddled and boundaries have changed numerous times. Tutar is. Her name is ubiquitous and is based in defiance, stone, and salt. From passenger ships and navy ships to sports teams, companies, and even she is portrayed as a national hero in women's football club schools. Statues of Tutar holding a sword and looking out over the horizon once with her fleet under her control. She has emerged as the Adriatic's enduring protector and queen, not only of the. Her significance transcends boundaries in the cultural current as well as the past. The Tutar's experience provides a unique perspective on the more general discussion of women in leadership. Glimpse of female leadership at an era and location where it was virtually unheard of, challenging contemporary stereotypes regarding gender and authority in antiquity. Her name is now mentioned with women who dared to rule in a world dominated by men, such as Cleopatra, Boudica, and Zenobia. Perhaps the most amazing thing that a woman, so inadequately documented, was that they left an empire in their wake that was quivering. By her peers, primarily through the taunts of Roman authors today, stands tall as a symbol of brave resistance and empowerment. Although Tutar only held power for a few turbulent years, her name has endured for centuries, and every tale told to a kid about the queen, who disobeyed Rome, is still remembered in every port where Tutar continues to sail. Though not in battleships, the sea served as her realm in memory, and the tale in 1803, the United States achieved one of the most incredible real estate transactions in history with a single pen stroke and a $15 million swap. President Thomas, the Louisiana Territory was a vast tract of territory that Jefferson purchased from France. It was more than just a few acres. This was more than 800,000 square miles of unexplored territory outside of New Orleans. Wilderness that extended beyond Jefferson and from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. Was excited that the land would guarantee space for westward migration and guarantee authority over important trade routes. But their one minor issue was that maps were imprecise and nobody truly knew what was out there. There were tales of woolly mammoths and huge mountains in the legendary Northwest, access to Asia and river networks that might transport you to the Pacific or perhaps. Jefferson didn't require any answers at all, and he intended to quickly fill in that blank map into something concrete, something actual. Therefore, he came up with a scheme to deliver a tiny light squad west to investigate the new area, map its topography, build relationships with local tribes, and preferably for this extraordinary undertaking, locate a direct waterway to the Pacific Ocean. Meriwether Lewis, a former army captain and Jefferson's personal secretary, had an unquenchable. Lewis's interest in science and environment led him to select William Clark, an elderly friend who has served in the military and is an experienced outdoor enthusiast, will co-lead the trip. Lewis and Clark had distinct personalities. Lewis was serious and brooding, while Clark was steady, sociable and pragmatic. Yet when combined, they precisely complemented each other's. They were to take notes on everything, plants, animals, rivers, rocks, in order to obtain information rather than to conquer, and languages. They were explorers, naturalists, diplomats, and, let's be honest, the expedition was anything from a walk in the woods, would transport them across wild rivers, thick woods, blazing plains, and snowy mountains with just handwritten signs in place of supply stations, GPS, and lifelines. The scene was created by journals, iron resolve, and the notion that the Pacific was somewhere in the western fog was situated in a great mystery that a fledgling nation had purchased, and two men were prepared to step entering it with only their bravery and the president's order. Lewis and Clark required a group of people, not just any group of travelers, before they could venture into the wilderness. Men that could hunt their own food, fix damaged equipment, row upstream for weeks, fight when necessary, and get along are needed. In confined spaces without privacy, for years in short males who are resilient enough to This elite group is referred to be the core of discovery, since they are able to survive everything. Lewis and Clark established the recruitment process in the winter of 1803-1804. Located on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River at located Du Bois, slightly north of St. Louis, it would act as their staging area and training site. They mostly hired tough, competent frontiersmen from military outposts. The majority of disciplined soldiers and riflemen were single and in their 20s. Among them were men like Master Tracker George Druid, who were yearning for adventure, and interpreter, as well as John Ordway, a capable but tough sergeant who assisted in enforcing discipline. This was more than just scouting. Each recruit took an oath to the mission. Party was a branch of the US government that represented the aspirations of a developing country. Although Lewis and Clark would take the lead, all men had a part to play, including blacksmiths, carpenters, hunters, cooks, and others. To assist raise spirits, even musicians were invited, and supplies weren't any less. The crew gathered trade goods and loaded a custom-built keelboat with a cabin and sail OEs to provide medical kits, scientific equipment, beads, knives, mirrors, peace medals featuring Jefferson's likeness, and tools, muskets, gunpowder, and more than 200 pounds of journal paper and ink. Throughout the winter, men trained rowing, sailing, and portaging every day, and shooting skills. They discovered how to live together, obey commands, and have faith in their commanders. Flogging was a severe kind of discipline, but the bond they created would turn into their most potent tool for the trip ahead. And by May 1804, with a corps of 40 men ready, they began rowing up the Missouri River. It was the start of a voyage that would carry them against the current into a place that few Americans had ever seen. They hoped that on May 14, 1804, they would be able to go over mountains, past tribal tribes, and all the way to the Pacific. After formally leaving Camp Du Bois, the Corps of Discovery started rowing up the Missouri River. The longest river in, for the men on board, North America, marked the beginning of something extraordinary. Even still, they had no idea how long it would last, or how they would deal with the undiscovered area on the maps. Were blank. Everything was a guess. The Missouris were particularly difficult during the expedition's initial phase. Pulling ropes from the riverbanks required hours of backbreaking labor every day due to the strong current that worked against them. There were sandbars where people could push poles into the riverbed or raise sails when the wind was favorable. Scorching summer heat, drowned logs, and hordes of mosquitoes. But even in the beginning, Lewis and Clark made it apparent that this was more than just a journey. It was a scientific excursion. They painstakingly documented observations of plants, animals, and other species every evening. Habits, river conditions, and weather patterns. They drew maps and used chains and sextants to measure distances. They weren't merely exploring. They were recording the new American. The core of the frontier went through areas where many Native American tribes had resided for generations and had a thorough understanding of the plains and waterways. The expedition's first significant encounter with the Ottoman Empire and the meeting between Missouri tribes at modern-day Nebraska was ceremonial, diplomatic, and important. Clark presented presents and medals as Lewis described the US's recent territorial ambitions, a notion that many indigenous, although leaders were skeptical, diplomacy won out for the time being, and the core pressure on wildlife became a wonder and a danger, grizzly bears that were previously unknown to the Americans were much more violent than expected, and the men were tortured by swarms of gnats and mosquitoes. Prairie dogs never stopped while bison herds thundered across the grasslands. Lewis was so astounded by what he saw before Easterners that he attempted to transport one back to Jefferson alive by October 1804. After 5 exhausting months on the river, they arrived at the communities of Mandan and Hidata in modern-day North Dakota. As the Missouri iced over and snow started to fall, the Corps constructed Fort Mandan and got ready to spend the winter amid the. However, even though they had traveled hundreds of miles, the Rocky Mountains still posed the greatest obstacle in their path. As the Missouri River froze and the winter fell, The great unknown beyond was also waiting. Expanded the core of discovery and spent the winter at Fort Mandan, a rudimentary yet robust log building constructed close to the Mandan and Hidata settlements tribes. It was late 1804, and the temperature dropped well below zero. Men worked throughout the season fixing equipment, replenishing supplies, and engaging with the indigenous tribes, whose hospitality and expertise would prove priceless. The Mandan and Hadza were seasoned farmers and traders in their communities, thriving even during the harshest winter months, and their kindness enabled the core to endure. The two tribes also had. They mentioned mountains, which are even more valuable than food brains. Ahead of far-off rivers and a shadowy group known as the Shoshone Hudwelt, close to the known world's western border, a tribe that Lewis and Clark had to locate immediately because if the Shoshone were to have any chance of crossing the Rockies and making it to the Pacific, they would need horses, recognized to possess them, and Sacagawea joins the narrative. At this point, during their Tucson Shabano, a French-Canadian fur trapper was employed by Lewis and Clark as an interpreter during their stay. He arrived with his young wife, Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman who had been abducted as a child and sold to. Even though Shabano was still a teenager and expecting at the time, Sacagawea soon shown that she was much more than just the trapper's wife in February 1805, giving birth to Jean-Baptiste, a boy who was given the nickname Pomp by Clark. And 2 months later, Sacagawea set up with her baby slung on her back, off with the core. And as they continued traveling west, her presence changed. She was able to interact with Shoshone bands as an interpreter during the first voyage. They would eventually come across. Second, she was familiar with some of the terrain. And third, maybe most significantly, she served as a symbol of peace. A woman bearing a child war parties did not bring families to the core, but rather tribes they encountered along the route. Of Discovery departed Fort Mandan in April 1805, armed with improved maps and more robust provisions, and roaring rivers, tall mountains, and no obstacles stood in the way of a new optimism had before encountered. But now they had Sacagawea, a silent powerhouse who would influence their mission's outcome as the center of Discovery moved farther into the continent in the spring of 1805. The once broad and muddy Missouri River started to constrict and twist through steep valleys and became increasingly tumultuous. The surrounding area was rising instead of being a peaceful grassland. The expedition was entering the upper Missouri Basin, which was rough and wild. The landscape was shifting against them, and they soon faced one of the most difficult physical obstacles they had ever faced: the tremendous Missouri Falls, rather than the lone cascade Lewis had expected. They had to overcome 5 obstacles, including a 21-meter rapids course and cascades. The Corps had to transport supplies and watercraft over arid terrain in a cruel after more than a month of grueling work. The men transported loads of merchandise across the portage, acres of prickly pear cacti and hordes of insects that bite while pulling. Despite the difficulties the portage faces, massive boats with homemade wheels traverse undulating terrain. Was a pivotal moment as well. The falls verified that the expedition was headed in the correct direction, as reported by the natives. Highlighted the falls, and arriving at them demonstrated that, if it existed, the legendary Northwest Passage might be located just beyond. However, the river brought them directly into the Rocky Mountains, rather than an easy path to the west mountains. By August 1805, the Corps had arrived at the Missouri River's 3 forks. They followed the Jefferson, where the river divides into the Madison and Gallatin. Finding Sacagawea's people by following her childhood recollections, they soon came across a small group of Shoshone, and in a remarkable turn of events, the chief turned out to be. The poignant reunion with Sacagawea's own brother Camelweight couldn't have happened at a more ideal moment. Through Sacagawea and her tribe's newly acquired trust, the Corps was able to obtain the horses and guides needed for the upcoming. The idea of a waterway to the Pacific was dwindling at this point in the voyage, but with horses and Shoshone assistance, it was now feasible to traverse the Rockies because the river had carried them a long far. But now the mountains would put them to the test, and the upcoming weeks would be the most taxing of the whole journey, with the Chaussonnier horses now in place. And the corps of discovery faced their next and most difficult challenge when the hope of a northwest passage by water was proclaimed dead. Journey across the snow-covered Bitterroot Mountains in western Montana and Idaho, which gave the impression that the Rockies were forgiving. This was hardly an excursion. Instead, the Chaussonnier and subsequently the Ens Perce Lewis provided survival guidance, and Clark guided their troops into the Bitterroot's high passes in September 1805, just as the first snowstorms started to hit the trail, which was treacherous, narrow, and covered in snow. The men's hands and faces cracked from the cold as they skidded down icy pathways, had nothing to hunt. Their horses were starving, and the soldiers were forced to eat soup prepared from candles. At times, they were only able to go a mile a day using animal hides and whatever roots they could find. As they entered Nez Perce territory, the corps was about to crumble. The Nez Perce could have attacked if they had been malnourished, worn out, and barely alive. Although they possessed the numbers and the element of surprise, the Nez Perce tribe showed mercy by feeding the men dry. Salmon and Karma's route, recuperate. It was a crucial point. The expedition might not have died immediately after being retrieved. Buried in a mountain pass, Lewis and they constructed new dugout boats and tamed their horses in the rivers that are today the Clear. Eventually, the powerful Columbia would transport them the remaining distance to the Pacific, but they were now aware of something they were initially unaware of. There was no direct waterway across the mountains blocked off the continent, making the Northwest Passage, which generations of explorers had dreamed for, completely non-existent, the continent in half. Yet they persisted and managed to reach the core, racing over new rivers and overcoming new threats as winter approaches. Yet spirits were rising once more. They had survived the worst that nature had to offer. And the ocean's scent was no longer. A fantasy was real, and it was only a few chapters away from Chapter 7's arrival in the Pacific. Following months of adversity, the core of the revelation surfaced in October 1805, untamed interior, and started to descend the Columbia River, a watercourse that would bring them, for the first time in more than a year, to the Pacific Ocean. As they moved downstream, the terrain changed and the air became more humid. Although the rivers were teeming with salmon and the trees were denser, things weren't always easy. Despite its grandeur, Columbia has dangerous rapids. Whirlpools and sharp rocks made it difficult to navigate. One mistake might destroy a canoe and throw troops or supplies to the depths. Equipment was lost when the boat overturned, but the corps persisted because of something. More resilient than fear, they traversed lands en route to their destination, home, to several strong and numerous tribes, including the Walla Walla, Yakima. In several instances, tensions increased, despite Chinook and others' ongoing trade and diplomacy, particularly when tribal traditions conflicted with the military discipline of the corps, but no conflicts erupted, and numerous tribes given intelligence and fish routes in return for gifts, knives, or silver peace medals from Jefferson. The Pacific Ocean was then visible to them in mid-November 1805, or more specifically, they observed the Columbia River roiling with storm gusts and tidal waves. Clark in his journal he wrote, "Oh, in view, oh the joy they had made it." Following more than the cause of discovery had reached the far western limit of the 4,000-meter journey across rivers, plains, and mountains. Continent, but the cause arrived just in time, so the Pacific didn't exactly throw a lavish party. Rain rained for weeks during a wretched coastal winter, and supplies were scarce. Food was more difficult to find than anticipated, and the men were damp and chilly. The core vote was complicated by local tribes, such as Sacagawea, and when deciding where to spend the winter, Clark's black slave York ultimately chose a protected location south of the river. They constructed Fort Clatsop, close to what is now Astoria, Oregon, and they would stay there for the next 4 months, making maps, recording coastal animals, and getting ready for the arduous trek. The expedition was halfway home, but the most dangerous phase was still to come. returning to life in March 1806, following 4 Soggi. The Corps of Discovery packed their equipment, destroyed what they couldn't carry, and endured bone-chilling months in Fort Clatsop. They had reached the Pacific, but heading east would not be a victory lap. The journey back was almost as difficult as the trip west. Their supplies were scarce, their clothing was tattered, and the spring rains transformed paths to mud once more, depending on the kindness of locals. Tribes, such as the Walla Walla and Clatsop Nez Perce, to subsist by trading what few things they left behind for the food horses and ways to recross the Bitterroot. When snow first blanketed the upper passes, the mountains were just as unpleasant. As there was less game, the guys were more worn out, thinner and hungry, but more realized that what had before been ad hoc speculation was now directed. Lewis and Clark instinctively divided the corps into 2 groups after crossing the division. On the way back, Lewis headed north toward the Maris River in order to investigate additional ground. In an attempt to more precisely delineate the Louisiana Purchase's northern border, his team ran into the Blackfeet warriors, resulting in the only bloody altercation during the second expedition. Following their attempt to seize firearms and horses, young Black Footat was slain in a skirmish by Clark's troops. New routes are being carved by the Yellowstone River, and landmarks like the well-known Pompey's Pillar, which still bears, by late summer 1806, the 2 groups were back together, with Clark's name engraved on the rock. Spirits were high along the Missouri River, and the terrain now appeared. When they arrived at the settled area, smaller landmarks that had before been unknown became recognized. News of Missouri's edge spread swiftly, and they had survived to return to the corps. On September 23, 1806, they returned to St. Louis and were welcomed as heroes. Many people thought they were dead after being gone for more than 2 years, yet they came back with maps, notebooks containing extensive information about dozens of native tribes they had passed, as well as 178 new plant and animal species. The continent and, more significantly, demonstrated that it was possible for a fledgling country still figuring its identity. Lewis and Clark's return marked the start of a frontier, more than merely the conclusion of a voyage. The epic trip came to an end with the return of the Corps of Discovery, but Lewis and Clark's legacy began as well. Were acclaimed for their notebooks, their maps became national heroes and the basis of the United States westward expansion. They had failed to discover a continuous waterway to the Pacific. However, they returned with a much more valued image of the huge, wealthy, and multifaceted American West president. Jefferson was overjoyed that the expedition had accomplished its goal and more. Just the scientific items were astounding. They were fossilized flora, animals, and even the detailed reports of native nations were conveyed to Washington, along with live animals like prairie dogs and magpies. Their governmental systems, languages, and customs were crucial reading for explorers in the future, legislators, but Lewis and Clark's tale didn't finish there. Cleanly, William Clark began a lengthy career in public service, rising to the position of governor of he reared Sacagawa's son while serving as administrator of Indian Affairs and Missouri Territory. Jean-Baptiste continued to interact with indigenous tribes, giving them the nickname Pomp. Throughout his life, Meriwether Lewis has served as a friend and an enforcer of U.S. expansion, but was hampered by political disputes, debt, and deteriorating health after being appointed governor of the Louisiana Territory. Lewis passed away in 1809, 3 years after the trip, due to mental health issues. Mysterious circumstances, most likely suicide, at Tennessee's Natchez Trace was just 35 years old, and Sacagawa's life after the voyage is still somewhat. She died young in 1812, according to documents, though some oral. Although customs indicate she lived a considerably longer life, it is certain that her presence was crucial. Without her, the Corps may never survive the Rockies or won the confidence of important tribes because to her quiet, strong, and resilient nature. The expedition's destiny was altered by intelligence, even though history texts didn't always give her clear. The center of discovery changed the way Americans viewed their nation. demonstrated that the continent was enormous, linked, and already home to a variety of independent countries. They opened a door that would soon be flooded with Lewis and Clark's ambition. Settlers and soldiers didn't merely discover fresh territory, they were on the brink of something much bigger. The United States' future, and it would never be the similarly, beneath the booming tourist traffic and bustling Istanbul, there is a universe carved in. Imagine a universe that, little by drop, once sustained the Byzantine Empire, named the Basilica Cistern, and you might not have realized that beneath the cobbles if you didn't know where to look. Amidst the hustle and bustle of contemporary life, an old water-still cathedral, the Cistern, which was constructed in the 6th century under Emperor Justinian, is more than just a storage facility. Tank is a 9,800 square meter castle that has been inverted, contained 80,000 cubic meters of water, all of which was concealed beneath the city's underpinnings. But this was more than simply a pit, it was elegant architecture. After a devastating event, Justinian ordered the creation of this underground wonder with vision and purpose. His dominion, which was already damaged by fire, and a slew of uprisings that rocked the city water shortages, were unaffordable for its palaces and public due to pestilence and rioting. Baths or its inhabitants, the Cistern was designed to guarantee survival and provide. Constantinople is a hidden treasure trove throughout sieges and difficult times. Yet maybe what makes the most striking aspect of Basilica Cistern is not its size, but rather its design. The arching roof is silently supported by 336 marble columns, each about 9 meters tall. Many of the sentinels were stolen or repurposed from previous pagan temples. Their disparate styles allude to the hurry and improvisation that went along with their installation. The temperature drops when you enter the chamber after descending the stone stairway. The water's surface ripples softly beneath wooden surfaces, and wetness clings to the air. Passageways, and everywhere you look, amber-lit shadows dance across columns. This was never supposed to be visible, yet it was constructed with such respect for form that its grandeur matches that of any basilica. Above ground, an upside-down cathedral built to house the earth's most important gift above the heavens, rather than to honor them. Religion and power changed over centuries of conflict. But underneath in the silence, in the Basilica Cistern waited in the shadows, maintained and prepared to be a world that had forgotten what was beneath its feet. Found it in water was not only a need in ancient Constantinople, it was also a strategy for survival and sovereignty. Although it wasn't the only reservoir in the city, Basilica Cistern was one of the biggest and most. Its vital purpose was to supply the vast palace of Constantinople, and it was nourished by aqueducts that extended miles from afar. Sources, such as the imposing Valens Aqueduct in the Belgrade woodland. At the time, there were hundreds of thousands of people living in the city, and they all needed fresh water, not only for drinking, but for fountains, public baths, and even imperial gardens in the past. Water easily flowed through the city's complex infrastructure. But Constantinople was a fortress in the same way that the system's genius was in the city, where siege was a constant threat. In its obscurity, allowing invaders to poison external wells or cut off aqueducts. They were unable to touch what they were unaware was concealed behind a plain structure that had formerly been a basilica. The system served as a covert reservoir that supplied the palace, hence the name, complex and adjacent neighborhoods, even while the city's walls were being devastated by war. Its creation was an accomplishment of thousands of slave laborers and artists, worked in both engineering and labor. Materials from all around the empire, especially from temples in Asia Minor, were recycled under imperial commands. Because of this, some of the columns are plain, some are ornately fluted, and some are strangely mismatched. However, they were taken, used, and revitalized for the benefit of the empire. Its design is unquestionably gorgeous, and its purpose was solely utilitarian. The columns vanish into quiet, dark water as the filters descend in golden shafts. Visitors today characterize the quiet as being interrupted only by the soft lapping of droplets that fall from the ceiling. Ethereal, eerie and graceful like a church constructed for as empires fell and others flourished over the ages, the Basilica Cistern gradually disappeared from the public consciousness, was forgotten and was eventually forgotten. Covered completely, it turned into one of the city's secret waterways, continuing to function long after its few locations represent Constantinople's creativity. Not only was this subterranean sea superior to this quiet genius, but it was stone water defiance kept under a flaming, disintegrating world. For the Basilica Cistern was neglected for centuries, although it was never demolished or ruined, merely concealed when the city rose under the Ottoman Empire and the Byzantine Empire collapsed, converted churches into mosques, rebuilt palaces, moved streets, and names changed. But the cistern continued to gather water beneath everything in silence, silent and dark, and by the time Constantinople was overrun by the Ottomans, in 1453, the system had, the famed Ottoman architects themselves have long vanished from popular awareness, had its own water management systems and hardly ever used the older Byzantine methods, which they regarded as antiques, of a different era, and as a result, the Basilica system became obscure, destroyed but disregarded. But as is sometimes the case with hidden treasures, it was unable to stories about staying buried forever, started to spread among residents of Istanbul's Sultanahmet neighborhood, stated that by lowering buckets into holes in their basement, they could extract water and even capture fish. Others cursed their cellars as they heard unsettling voices and echoes emanating from underground, remained abnormally chilly despite the intense summer heat, provoking curiosity. Not until 1545, over a millennium after it was built, was the cistern officially found that Petrus Gilas, a researcher studying the old city's topography, had listened to local rumors and looked into breaking into a private residence. He went into the dark by torchlight and discovered, under the soil, there is a huge echoing chamber of stone and water that is wonderfully maintained. Explained the area in amazement as the columns vanished into the shadows. Fish as he glided across. The still water, he occasionally heard a slight ripple above his. Writings brought the system back into the public eye, and gradually its myth reappeared. However, the system continued to be mostly ignored by the people even after it was rediscovered. Utilized it as a fishery or well on occasion, but it wasn't lit up or made accessible to the public for generations. Remained the realm of whispers and shadows. Contemporary archaeology tourism didn't emerge until the 20th century. With restoration, the Basilica Cistern became another Istanbul treasure. However, it collected a priceless mystique during that extended hibernation that was locked beneath a live metropolis, and in that mysticism, entering the Basilica system is like entering a legend rather than just a reservoir, entering a forgotten realm where time lingers like a fog and all sounds are absorbed by stone. There are 336 marble floors all around you as soon as your foot touches the wooden walkway. Like a forest carved by forgotten hands, columns rise from dark water. One is almost 9 meters tall and, like ancient titans, supports the vated brick roof above. Planet. But these recycled columns weren't designed for the system. From neglected ruins, temples, and palaces throughout the Roman, Greek, and even pagan art of the empire came together underneath, creating a system that resembles a mosaic made of some. Cultures have plain, smooth columns, while others have elaborate fluted tops. Some of the Corinthian capitals are uneven or cracked, showing their second hand. It seems as though each piece of nature has a lost tale that is separated from its genesis, reborn to contain water rather than gods. The brick ceiling and the construction is utilitarian, yet the mortar creates a network of silent arches. The air is cold, humid, and thick with inspiration, and the scale is almost mystical. The pillars and arches are reflected in changing hypnotic patterns by the centuries-old light that shimmers on the water's surface. Water drips from the roof in a soft cadence that reverberates off the stone and murmurs into the cavern below. Carp, descendants of those introduced, float languidly through black water on pathways. There is a sense of awe because they are the only living beings who have never left. Here, not in a religious sense, but rather in the context of the time, you're in columns taken from temples built by slaves and left behind by civilizations. And the room is silent now that it is well lit for contemporary eyes, not because it must be, but people automatically become quiet, as though the cistern itself demands respect, since it is a living reminder of Roman grandeur rather than merely a ruin. Ottoman apathy, Byzantine pragmatism, and contemporary amazement. Columns support more than simply the ceiling. They also support history, stillness, and the gap between the past and the present. And they only ask that you listen from a distance. Beyond the rows of darkened columns and flickering reflections in the northwest corner of the cistern are two, of the most. The Medusa heads these enigmatic and recognizable features of the basilica. Cistern 2 columns are supported by enormous stone carvings, whose origins are unclear. Their purpose is up for debate, and there, the first Medusa head rests, on its side, its expressions permanently set in stone, supporting one column as if it were thrown away carelessly, while the second is equally bizarre. Her hair was upside down and dangled into her face's moisture, hauntingly serene. No plaque describes them, and no inscription indicates where they came from. Just where did they originate? According to most academics, they were transported from, possibly devoted to the goddess Athena. This late Roman temple was later utilized as handy building material is just one more instance of Justinian's empire recycling its history. But the reality that the selection of 2 similar legendary characters, both concealed in a shadowy area of the system, implies something more than Greek mythology describes Medusa as a gorgon, a creature with snakes for hair. Random recycling. Her image was frequently used as a metaphor of someone whose look could turn men to stone, a type of defense etched into floors, entrances, and shields to repel. Perhaps she was positioned here as a protective talisman beneath the surface, protecting the city's vitality, or is it a more political matter? Placing Medusa on her side or upside down, according to certain historians, was a symbolic act of defiance against pagan authority in support of Christian governance, as though to declare, the ancient gods are now in danger. Mute and helpless. However, nothing is verified, which is what makes them strong. The sound of flowing water, and the low lighting falling on their faces, surrounding them, and how they sleep beneath the weight of generations. It all forms a sensation that they are merely present, not malicious or enraged, while they watch the columns that are the unexplained echo in a region that is otherwise ordered. You remain for the silence, although the Medusa head's quiet is odd, and that linger in your mind long after you've left. The Basilica system is more than just a feat of architecture. It is a slow-motion sensory experience. Inside, the contemporary world is blurry, and your eyes get used to the soft amber illumination. You are abruptly transported outside of Istanbul, when your ears detect the echo of a single droplet dropping from the arched ceiling. You're in an area where time and light travel differently, and sound acts strangely. Instead of echoing as usual, footsteps bounce lightly off moist surfaces. Stone talks are kept quiet, not out of politeness, but rather because of the weight of as centuries pass. Even the fish appear to swim silently, as though they respect the quiet before the light comes in during the day, which comes from a few natural shafts, faint sunbeams from above that shine through the darkness like searchlights from another. Modern lighting creates striking shadows in the deepest regions of the globe or at night. Every change in perspective reveals the column's uneven textures and misaligned shapes. Something fresh, a new column base, a raised ceiling, and the shimmer of wetness on. A stone face turns into a mirror as the quiet dark water, just a few feet deep, changes. Doubles the space's height by reflecting the columns above, transforming the system into a hall of. Sometimes it's difficult to distinguish between the stone and its reflection due to illusions. Occasionally, a droplet falls, or a fish gently ripples across the surface, giving the impression that the cistern is. In the present era, musicians and artists have been breathing slowly and peacefully. Its acoustics are unparalleled, and the hum of a single cello is what draws people here to perform. A voice chanting slowly takes on an unearthly quality, and the system doesn't only echo retains sound for a long time after it is created, much like water does, but even without music, the room feels alive. Not eerie, but conscious, with each arch feeling as though every column serves as a sentinel. Every sound is a whisper from a different time and the doorway. The Basilica system is more than just a sight. It's a religious experience. Halt amid the city's cacophony, where silence turns into a sort of song and shadow becomes a story. The Basilica system existed for centuries as a useful area designed for eventually forgotten and then found. Survival has evolved into a completely new representation of Istanbul's complex identity. Restoration work on a combination of myth and empire, water and stone, east and west, started seriously. As interest in conserving Istanbul's historic treasures increased in the 1980s, the system had seen flooding, neglect and sporadic abuse, even serving at times as an illicit fishing operation or dumping site. But conservation teams emptied the lake, restored deteriorating columns, put in wooden walkways, and added subdued lighting. By 1987, it was formally reopened to the public. Visitors started to arrive in small numbers before swarming in. What was previously hidden beneath the city's surface is now one of Istanbul's most popular tourist destinations. Magazines admired it, photographers looked for its shadows, and writers discovered directors, of course, saw something completely different in its quiet metaphors, atmosphere. The Basilica Cistern quickly turned into a background for movies, providing its eerie atmosphere to everything from films to documentaries, most notably the the 1963 James Bond movie, From Russia with Love. The Euro 7 ascended a small boat between the columns under Istanbul. More recently, it appeared in the 2016 film Inferno, which was based on Dan Brown's thriller, transforming the historic reservoir into a setting for contemporary tension. But the cistern is more than just a movie location. It is a reflection of Istanbul as a whole, continuously constructed on top of its own, with churches, mosques, palaces, and other structures underneath. The history of buildings beneath our feet serves as a reminder that even beneath our daily life, the ruins of ancient civilizations silently wait. The change from utility to icon that is concealed just beneath the surface is, it no longer contains water for emperors, but it still contains meaning for residents, visitors, and artists, as it links the present to the past. A location that was once constructed in secrecy without any words or ceremony today entices people all around the world to speak its name. It is more than just a system, gateway to enigmatic memory and the hidden core of a city that won't. It's simple to overlook how delicate the Basilica system was in the past and how close it was to being completely lost. The building lacks a grand entrance and a tall facade, and it was intended to sparkle and vanish, but it has endured. The relentless passage of time, earthquakes, invasions, and neglect. But survival does not occur by chance. Rather, a succession of silent guardians, not emperors or generals, are responsible for the system's survival. However, engineers, academics, and inquisitive residents who didn't allow it to vanish it was unofficially maintained during the Ottoman era by locals who obtained it from wells, and vendors. They might not have been aware of its entire scope, but they appreciated the cold, pure water it provided. Scholars like Petrus Gillis in the 19th and 20th centuries may have felt a feeling of mystery beneath their homes. Much later, Turkish archaeologists started to seriously document the system, plotted its columns, located the marble's birthplace, and started posing the queries that transformed it from a secret space into an intriguing topic. And their silent commitment served as the foundation for restoration, and today it's the preservationists, guardians, and guides. They are currently protecting it, keeping its structure balanced, controlling humidity, algae, and making sure guests are safe when walking on suspended walkways in still water must be controlled. The columns must be observed, and even the light must be carefully adjusted. Too little is done to break the mood, and the past disappears once more. Protected by narrators who impart its history and give meaning to the quiet, every guide, every silent tourist who stays a little longer in front of the Medusa, heads in the documentary, becomes a steward of the system, as well as the residents of Istanbul who grew up hearing stories of fish in the basement wells are for them. The cistern is more than simply a tourist in the dim stone chambers beneath the city. Place, a legend they've always heard about, is located directly beneath the surface, so the Basilica Cistern survives even when the empires above have collapsed, and the palaces they occupied are now museums. Not because it demanded attention, but because centuries refused to let it be forgotten. Not all guardians wield swords. Some people respect the Basilica Cistern, or carry flashlights and notes. It is memory that is silently suspended beneath the throb of contemporary life, more than stone and water. In Istanbul, the clamour of taxis, the ringing of tram bells, or everything slows down when the call to prayer rings overhead, so you don't go to the cistern, as much as delve into it, as though you were into a dream that the earth itself was whispering. Nothing is noisy here, and the columns are silent, which is where true power is found. Don't brag about the Medusa heads, don't shout the arches, and don't explain yourself. And yet, if you know how to listen, everything communicates gently and calmly. When water reflects off the ceiling and the ceiling reflects time, you start to question whether this isn't the type of memorial that honors the fact that the location is actually underground or just beyond the bounds of reality. Faith or conquest doesn't have mosaic saints or gilded domes. It just persists. Its beauty lies in its ability to transform the pragmatic into the originally designed to contain water. It now contains wonder, which every guest takes away. Some people find it amazing that a building so old could still for others. It's a moment of peace and respite from the commotion above. And many people wonder why the Medusa heads were positioned that way. How many lost hands toiled silently to shape these columns, construct this location, which is still alive today when the trip comes to a close and you ascend the magic doesn't completely end when you take a step back toward daylight and emerge into the fragrance of roasted chestnuts, the sound of automobiles, and footfall in the sunshine. But a piece of you remains. A part of you can still see the flicker of gold light on ancient objects and hear the sound of water dripping. Stone. The Basilica Cistern serves as a reminder that beneath the surface, every city, every kingdom, and every tale has a greater meaning. They say the waters run deep, and there's something older waiting in the shadows. They reverberate eternally in the center of Istanbul.